All right. Welcome to webinar number 3 in our youth ministry training series. Tonight's webinar is Safety in Youth Ministry. I am Kim Sweeney, your host and co-presenter, and I am here this evening with Evin Carville-Zemer.
Yes. Very close. This is from Mark Bellatini. Love prayer. Love, you are strong as the dark blue mountain. Love, you are as fluid as the wide silver river. Love, you are as splendid as the clear night sky. Love, you are as mysterious as the dark forest. Love, you are as wise as an enduring friendship. Love, you are true power, not mere distraction, truth, not deceit, purpose, not impulse, poetry, not prose, sing, not sang, now more than tomorrow, but tomorrow more than yesterday. Love, condense yourself into this moment. Permeate the silence that joins us in community so that the fire of the words to come, the promises of this hour, might be sealed in peace.
Thanks, Evin. So I am Kim Sweeney. I am one of the New England regional staff folks for the UUA. I am talking to you all this evening from my home in Western Massachusetts. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what brings me to this work, and Evin will do the same. But while we're doing that, if you could find your way to the chat and let us know who you are, where you're serving, what your role is in the congregation that you are serving or working for, and if you have anybody with you this evening. I know some congregations are watching these webinars in groups, which is always great. So if you could introduce yourselves to us and each other in the chat, that would be fantastic. Just by way of a little bit of background, my portfolio, my role here in New England is working with faith formation and safe congregations work. I come to this work as a credentialed religious educator. I served as a DRE in New Hampshire for many years and was involved with our district youth programming at the time, where safety concerns came up a lot. And lo and behold, I found out that I'm actually in love with safety, which I find to be at its core an expression of covenant and an opportunity for us to be our full selves with each other in a safe container, safe space. Thank you all for doing some of your introductions here. I'm just quick shout out. I see somebody is here from East Hampton, Mass, which is exactly where I am right now. So Nia Thomas in East Hampton, you're probably across the street from me. So cool. Such a small little world. Evin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves while I geek out about the chat?
I am Evin Carville-Zemer. I serve the Central East region, and one of my program areas is youth ministry. As we have regionalized, we've put a lot of work into being sure that our youth communities are where they should be. And that process has been a huge learning for me in a number of different ways. And we've increased and changed our safety policies as that has gone along in response to the kinds of stories that I've heard from youth as I begin to ask them what about the real stories that happen. And that learning for me has been a lot about the real damage that is done when even something that the outside world might perceive as minor happens in the safe place of our religious community, and has deeply increased my commitment to being sure that our youth spaces are truly safe, especially from the ways that youth can inadvertently hurt each other.
Thanks, Evin. All right, so thank you all for introducing yourselves, and feel free to use that chat some more. I wanted to begin our time with a small passage from the Youth Ministry Advising Handbook that was just put out 4 years ago from Carrie McDonald and Jeremy Bateman, who both were working in the Youth and Young Adult Office at our UUA. They say one of the keys to providing a space where youth feel comfortable to grow, develop, and express their Unitarian Universalist values is to have clearly defined boundaries and safety policies. The goal of creating these boundaries is not to guarantee that nothing will go wrong, but rather to model healthy relationships and protect everyone involved, you, the youth, and the congregation. I love that. I just think it really sums everything up into this nice little package. If you don't have a copy of this book and you are working with youth, I highly recommend picking it up at the UUA bookstore. It's a great intro to youth ministry and working with youth. Thank you. So Evan and I are starting this webinar with a few assumptions, which we feel compelled to share with you. Tonight, we are specifically talking about ministry to and with high school aged youth, or the homeschooling equivalent, which is generally ages 14 to 18. There are certainly things to take into consideration for middle school youth, but for the purpose of this webinar this evening, we are really going to be focusing on high school aged youth. We have an assumption that the adults working with our youth are ages 25 or older, which is a best practice that we would highly recommend and suggest. So we are just going to assume that you and all of the adults working with your youth are ages 25 or older. We're going to be talking and focusing on congregationally based youth ministry and events. So we're not going to be talking about General Assembly, Youth Caucus. We're not going to be talking about district or regional programming or summer programming. We're really going to be talking and focusing mainly on the youth ministry and events that are hosted and held in congregations. And we assume that you, like us, have a shared commitment to maintaining safety for our congregations, for our youth, and the adults who work with them. So that's just our little disclaimer. That's what we're coming here with. We probably have about 50 more, but those seem like the biggest ones for tonight.
And then this slide is the things we're not talking about tonight that are important for safety. we had to do this first. Covenant with our youth is really important, and that will be part of the February webinar. Adult boundaries, appropriate adult behavior. We did that last month, and that is available on the UA website. We're not going to talk about trips off-site, but we have a handout we'll include in our email about that. We're not going to go over the details of permission forms, though you should have them, and we'll include a link to a sample. We're not going to talk about safety procedures on site, like crash bars on doors or working fire alarms or first aid kits. If your congregation has questions about that, I urge you to reach out to your local congregational life staff first there. And we're not going to talk about leadership code of ethics, though that's also important. It will include a link to a sample. And I'm realizing as Kim shares the assumptions, we have so assumed that you know the safe congregations information about background checking and reference checking your adults that we haven't included that either. So you can check on the safe congregations information on the UA website if you are not making sure adults have been part of your congregation for 6 months, if you're not reference checking them, if you're not background checking them. And I'm sure that your congregational life staff in your region would help you figure out how to do those things efficiently and inexpensively.
So now you might be asking, well, if they're not going to talk about that whole list, what in the world are they going to talk about tonight? We've identified 5 key areas that are that we've learned the most about recently, or there have been the most recent changes. These are also sometimes sorry, could you, yeah, thanks. Webinar fail 101. So we're also going to talk about things that are the least obvious or not very well recorded as of now. And some of these often require a deeper understanding to implement, including more community conversations. So we're going to scratch the surface. And please know, as Evan mentioned, if you have any follow-up questions, you're free to ask us. And also, each of your regions has a Safe Congregations person. Talk to your primary contact for more information. And if you're in New England, just call me. So the 5 big areas that we're going to talk about tonight are training. We're going to talk about social media and communication, sleeping arrangements at youth events, which is a big one, sex, minors, and the law, and structures and training to encourage youth to report. So yeah, we have like 45 minutes to zip through just all of those very minor areas, which now you might realize why we're not going to do that other page. So this is our starting point. Go ahead, Evan. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the training that is required for all staff and volunteers at your youth events. Training is needed for our youth, but also for our youth leaders, our advisors, and our parents. Our adults and our youth need to be on the same page and have a shared understanding of expectations for themselves and others. So the responsibilities and requirements of adults working with youth, as well as the tools and knowledge necessary to create inclusive environments. Some of these topic areas include knowing the signs of sex abuse. There are some great trainings that can be done online for that. Sex abuse prevention as well. Every state has different mandated reporting requirements. We could not put them all up here with all of you from different areas of the country, but please look up your state's mandated reporting requirements and make sure that your volunteers are aware of those. Each congregation will also have different reporting procedures. So as a mandated reporter, as a staff or volunteer, it may also be an expectation that you contact the religious educator or minister about any report that you have made. Each congregation, again, will be different, but it's good to know what those procedures and policies are. There are state-specific laws around minors and sexuality that really blew my mind when I learned about these a few years ago. Each state has a different age where they have determined that a person is able to consent to sexual activity. Regardless of what you or I or anyone else thinks, each state has a different law. And if that state has determined that anyone, for example, under the age of 17 is not able to consent, sexual activity would then be considered child sexual abuse, which is a big thing for us to be aware of, especially for our youth who are in our youth groups after they turn 18. Once our youth turn 18, it's a different ballgame for them completely. Legally, it's heartbreaking and it's awful. It just, you can Google it. I actually don't Google it right now. That would just be more depressing. But when we have youth who have been peers and then one of them turns 18 and they are still in our youth group, they're playing by a different set of rules, and it's very important that they know that, and the adults working with them and their parents. These are the types of trainings that should happen annually. The Religious Institute has a lot of resources, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel or be an expert in any of these certain topics, but making sure that these things happen for the adults working with our youth is key. Evan, you wanted to talk about the other part of this, yes?
There's two more pieces. I just wanted to add in from our notes that according to Church Mutual, that the areas that churches most often get scrutinized by are negligent hiring, negligent screening, negligent training, and negligent supervision.
This is true.
Thinking clearly about who's in the room with the youth, how you're training them, how you're supervising them is critical for safety in your program.
Right. And we spoke with Church Mutual in depth, and one of the things that they said is that if there ever was a claim around sex abuse, they're going to want to see, in writing when your volunteers had that training. So to keep your congregation safe and your volunteers and youth safe, it's best practice if everybody is trained on this anyway, but in order to protect your congregation from a liability perspective, you do want to say that you have offered and required these trainings for your adults working with youth.
You were going to talk about this, and then I'll talk.
So Church Mutual is one of the major, probably the most common insurance companies that our congregations have their insurance uses an insurance carrier. There are others, but I think Church Mutual is probably the main insurance provider for our congregations. So we also want to offer abuse prevention awareness. It occurred to me a few years ago that this is not something that as a parent we get when we have children, that nobody sits us down and does abuse prevention awareness. So our congregations are one of those places where that could happen. So we suggest having at least every other year abuse prevention awareness offered for children, youth, and their parents and guardians. Sometimes this can be done in conjunction with your OWL training, your Our Whole Lives Sexuality Education. And we want to put this in the context of positive sexuality. So we want to be talking with our children from a very young age and our youth, specifically around consent. Consent is real. And so we definitely want to include that with our abuse prevention awareness as well. That can also include safer internet use, which we'll talk a little bit more about social media in a bit, bystander and anti-bullying education, harm to self or others, and again, consent. So we want to definitely frame this as positive sexuality, not as a big negative thing, but making sure that we all are aware of the signs of abuse and can do our best to prevent that.
Sadly, yes, in the comments, we don't have a president who is demonstrating consent very well, president-elect. So we talk about training staff and volunteers, training parents. It's also really important that we're providing information to our youth. These are the areas that we think that all the youth should be trained in. And I would say this is a at least annual conversation and goes along with the creation of the covenant in the youth program. At the beginning of an event, if you were having an event with multiple congregations, you would want to go over this stuff there as well. Youth need a clear definition of harm to self or others. They need to know what it is that would get reported outside of the group. In particular, they do much better each other when they're aware of that information, and then they're able to come forward and help their friends come forward. And they need clear guidance on what to do with the gray areas. If it's not really clear what to do, so they're worried about their friend, but they're not sure if it violates the covenant and they have to tell, there should be a way for them to get adult assistance with that conversation, and they should know who they can go to talk about it. I tell my the chaplains in my programs that I run and my youth leaders that they're always free to call me with a hypothetical situation. I would much rather them call me with some hypothetical that gives me a chance to help them think things through than for them to think that they need to have all the information to decide on their own what should happen, because they are really trying to balance often the desire for privacy from a peer and the desire to keep the peer safe. And that's just too big of a burden, I think, for them to have to wrestle with on their own. There needs to be a clear process on what happens when confidentiality gets expanded. And I use expand because we're not breaking it and then telling everybody. We're expanding it to include those people who need to be brought in to help keep someone safe. Our youth need to know what happens, that there's a way that the resources will be brought in, that their peer is going to be supported and safe. I work with youth and I give them phrases to use. So I say, I'd like you to tell your friend when you feel like you need to tell, I care about you and I can't keep you safe. And this is what I need to do because I can't keep you safe. Our youth need to know about affirmative consent, asking before we touch people. That is critical, both for people not receiving touch they don't want and for people not accidentally touching others in ways they don't want. If we have particularly sexual touch that is not consensual, we have a child abuse situation. And so we want to protect both the victim in that circumstance and the unintentional perpetrator from being in a situation that we might need to report under mandated reporting laws. I use the words weird and uncomfortable with the youth. When things happen to us, this is a human brain thing. Our brains do everything possible not to feel like a victim. And so when youth get hurt, like most humans, they don't just say, oh, that was abuse, that was bullying, I'm supposed to tell. They reframe it. It felt weird, it felt uncomfortable. Well, maybe I did something wrong. Our culture does a lot to support that as well. And it's, I think, just human. So if they understand that, even if they don't think that it was a rule that was broken, even if they don't think it was bullying, we don't want people to feel weird and uncomfortable in our youth spaces. And so we want you to come forward if anything's weird or uncomfortable so we can talk about what to do. And I use case studies with youth. I think they work really well. Youth can still be pretty concrete thinkers, and they may not have case studies in their own heads. A lot of adults have some examples kicking around, but the youth may not have any. And so if they have an example, they're able to think things through and understand the real ramifications and risks. I've used a range of them. I've created just small paragraph ones that they need to talk about. And I've actually also created a whole choose your own adventure case study where you can see what happens in a very real situation about if leaders make different decisions about what to report or not.
Okay, so social media and communication. This is ginormous and changing every day, which is why we cannot give you too much of the concrete on this, because by the time we say anything about social media, there will be a new platform tomorrow with new implications. So what we want to do is really just give you some precautions as we continue to sort of dance through this evolution of technology. So precautions need to be taken in virtual spaces just as they are in physical spaces. So just as we advise adults not to be alone with youth in physical spaces, one-on-one, we generally ask that there are 2 adults in the space and that they're in a group or at least visible to a group. The same theory applies online. So we're always wanting another set of eyes or a record of our online communications and permission from parents about how we can communicate with their youth, especially given the ever-growing number of platforms that we have at our disposal and that our youth are using. They're using platforms that we probably don't know about. As a parent, I think that is true. Your congregation will want to have a written policy on the use of church computers and other technology and social media for clergy, for staff and volunteers, or youth advisors, whatever your structure is. But there should be a policy about how you will use the church's computers and also technology. And these policies should address things such as how staff and volunteers are able to interact with minors. For instance, if you're posting something on Facebook, are you allowed to tag somebody under the age of 18? Are you allowed to post photos of children? Most of our congregations, I believe, have a waiver that you would need to sign before you could post anything with children. Especially for our, we have many parents who are foster parents, and legally they cannot put pictures of their children on social media with their names. So it's really good to have some express permission around that. There needs to be a statement that the use of technology in faith-based organizations, it should be public, observable, and monitored by staff. So if you are a youth advisor, your communications with your youth need to be able to be observed by others as well. We've also bumped into situations where there requires a policy on reporting communication with minors that happens outside of a policy. For example, what do you do when a youth texts an adult with a question? What does the adult do with that? I was in a congregation once where anything that I texted, a parent was also copied, or anytime a youth advisor emailed, that back when our youth used email, anytime a youth advisor emailed the youth, the religious educator was also copied on that. So there was always that second set of eyes. So having a recorded form of that communication just to cover everybody's bases, should anything ever come up, is really helpful. Congregations are now asking for parental permission for ways to communicate with youth. For example, can we communicate with your youth on Facebook or email or text? There's different apps on GroupMe text where you can text your entire youth group. There's a Remind 101 text where you can also send reminders to a group and not an individual. And if there are emails, then copying parents is also advisable. I think that's all I have with social media and communication. Evan, did you have any other sort of nuggets of brilliance to share on that one?
We'll share the our Central East regional policy for our adult volunteers. It may not be exactly what you want locally, but I think it covers areas that will raise the conversations need to be raised.
Yeah, for lots of these things, we are able to share with you samples, which might not be the end all be all, but it's a starting point for you. Many of them will come from Central East because Evan has devoted their whole life to this. It is a big chunk of Evan's work. And we have some other samples from other regions and faith traditions to share with you as well.
So this is an area we've made major changes recently in the Central East region. These came about after a alleged non-consensual touch happened in our space that we needed to report to the state and therefore our insurance company, Church Mutual. And Church Mutual is not happy with the way Unitarian Universalists have traditionally done our youth sleeping, which has often been multi-gender and often in cuddling arrangements. And there have been evolutions in that in various ways across the country. You can spoon each other, but you can't share a blanket, etc. None of that's cutting it. So we had to come up with a solution that was trans and queer inclusive. Church Mutual just wanted boys and girls in separate rooms, and that wasn't going to work for our values. And this is the solution we came up with. The UUA staff negotiated this with Church Mutual. So I would recommend that you not put youth in any circumstances that are less strict than this, because especially if Church Mutual is your insurance company. So what we're doing in large events, so this could be you have a sleepover with a few congregations kind of event. It's only our largest congregations whose sleepovers really hit this level. Single gender room options are good. Some events choose to have a genderqueer room as well. I would say at least 3 youth in each room. And then multi-gender rooms, or all gender rooms. What this creates is a space where youth don't need to select a gender. They don't need to force themselves out, nor do they have to feel like they have to sleep somewhere that's uncomfortable for them. After programming's done, requiring that youth either be in the sleeping rooms or in one single lit supervised space. And that means that being in some other dark room is already off limits and already out of covenant. We don't need to catch youth behaving sexually, which has been a philosophy in the past that we can't do anything unless we catch them. We can require that they stay in spaces where we know what they're doing. In the sleeping spaces, there's no shared bedding and visible floor space between youth. I don't set an amount of visible floor space because then I'm accountable for maintaining. I know, like if it's less than 6 inches, then we've broken our policy. I say visible floor space. And then I would say that not just awake adults, I have a pair of youth awake too. I think it's important for youth to take responsibility for monitoring the safety of their community. And with a pair of youth and a pair of adults, they can, the pair of youth can circulate the building, and then the pair of adults can, and there is a awake witness in the awake lit space at all times. Of course, sweeping the building means opening any door that is not locked. So what we want here is there's witnesses present for touch. The dangerous place for us is particularly dark rooms where youth are touching and people aren't looking, particularly if there's only one youth awake. I have worries about our programs where there's any kind of covert sexual activity, also with our youth with difficulty processing social cues. I think we put them at risk for touching unintentionally in a non-consensual way. And we can prevent that by really pretty strictly monitoring that there's no sexual touch. And if platonic, back rubs or hugs and all only happen with witnesses. Alternately, in smaller events, this could be a single congregation. Could be a leadership event, having 2 adults sleep in each room of youth. The youth must agree to sleep. So there's a bedtime. The youth lay down in their sleeping bags with visible floor space and no shared bedding. And the adults are awake until the youth are lying down and quiet and going to sleep. This requires a high degree of trust, trust in your youth, trust in your adults, and a strong covenant between youth and adults. If that trust isn't there, this isn't a safe sleeping arrangement. If the trust is there, this can be a safe enough sleeping arrangement, because when youth understand the consequences of sexual touch, when they understand that any sexual touch that began to cross a line that moved into non-consensual touch would be a child abuse report, they get pretty serious about this, and they want to protect their space. They want to protect their peers. When they understand what that police report might do to the concerns about the youth programming, they want to prevent that too. And if you have that kind of relationship with your youth and you know that they're on board, this works well. However, don't do that without trust. In fact, I wouldn't hold an overnight event at all if there's not trust. Trust with the parents. The parents know what your safety policies are and they're agreeing to it, that you have trust with your youth. With the adults at the program, you're not going to find out later that the adults are like, yeah, whatever, I didn't bother sweeping the building. It wasn't important. With the congregational leaders and of course, trust that your folks trust you. And some people say, well, okay, there was this rule violation at another event earlier this year. So what am I going to do at the sleepover next month? Don't have the sleepover next month. If there's been boundary crossing at a recent event, it may take a lot of processing to rebuild trust, but that rebuilding process is important. A question from Jonah here in the chat. So positive picture of sexuality. I say to the youth, experimenting sexually is a developmentally appropriate thing for you to be doing in ways that you feel comfortable and safe with, that follow the OWL principles of mutual pleasure and consent. Because of our responsibilities to keep all youth safe, because we would have to report if something was not consensual, this isn't a good space for that experimentation. Because not all, and for emotional reasons for the other youth, it makes the space not safe for youth who are not feeling ready for that kind of experimentation. So it's emotional safety for the other youth, and it's a safety for the youth actually participating in the sexual activity. I assigned in a leadership training, I gave all the youth a rule to explain. And one of my pairs of youth who were given the no sexual activity to explain did a hysterical skit outlining what would be necessary if we did allow sexual activity. Well, here's my notarized permission form of my parents listing whom I'm allowed to have sex with. Here is the safer sex educator that you have to meet with and sign off on what methods you're using. And here's the consent monitor who will intervene if you do not ask each other at each level of progression. And of course, even then we probably couldn't do that. But that really hit home for those youth what would be necessary. So there's a funny way of going about it as well.
I think the other piece with that, and which is bridging right into this next segment, is that, when we're having our youth all together for an overnight or for any youth programming, we're really trying to foster an inclusive community, and sexual behavior in those community spaces is by virtue exclusive behavior. It's exclusive between two, or between a small number of folks, which definitely has an impact and an effect on the norms of the rest of the group and who's feeling in and who's feeling out. So it's also, I think, to protect the integrity of the group. So sex minors in the law, this can get pretty scary pretty fast, but this is where it's going to be helpful for you, your youth, and your the rest of your adults to really be informed about the law in your particular area. And I cannot tell you how much variation there is across the country. It was really shocking to see how different each state is with their understanding of the law and implementation. I guess I'm talking about all of these different bullets already. We've already talked about these. Yes, exclusive relationships distract from the community. Participants must respect each other's physical boundaries, which is where the consent piece comes in. And not just around the sexual piece, but respecting physical boundaries and physical space, period, is super important. So we suggest that it's written in your covenant or in your behavior agreement or whatever you have your youth sign to participate, that, well, and your adults too, participants must refrain from sexual, seductive, or erotic behavior while at the event. What you do on your own time is your own thing, but when you're here in our congregation, in our space, participating in this activity, that's all got to go. Sexual behavior between participants at the event and sexual harassment are not permitted and will not be tolerated. It has to be, kind of a zero tolerance sort of stance. And it's not because we're anti-sex. We're not. We're the people that co-created OWL. We are not known for being the anti-sex people, but what we are, is we want our youth to know what the limits of healthy sexual expression are. And when you're in this group setting, this is not the time and the place. Because the line from consensual to non-consensual, which when you cross that line, it's now considered child abuse, that behavior, that line can be crossed so easily. And because we usually have a large enough age span between the youngest and oldest youth, there's a huge possibility for us to be in violation of laws. We can't take the risk of child abuse happening in our programs or on site. And here's the piece about being a mandated reporter. It's not up for us to decide whether or not it was child abuse. It's not up for us to make that determination. But if you have a state law that says that a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old are not legally able to make any sort of, are not able to offer consent for sex, you have to report that. However you feel about that personally is irrelevant at that moment. As a parent of teens, it scares the crap out of me. But my personal feelings have to be put aside when I'm working with youth, to know what my responsibilities are as a mandated reporter. I know, super scary stuff, but please, your homework will be to go and look up what your mandated reporting requirements are. Oh, look at that. Finding out what the age of consent in your state is. Another thing to look up, it's sometimes known as the Romeo and Juliet law. It's a terrible name, I know, but it is what it is. That will talk about the age range and the age difference between youth that is acceptable or not acceptable in your state. You'll need to know and research which violations count as child abuse. Another reason that we don't provide links to this is that these laws apparently change fairly often. So the moment we put up the links, we would be potentially giving you the wrong information. So this is something you definitely want to check in on. I would do it twice a year because apparently things change that fast in all of these different states. Also research sharing substances with minors, beyond the obvious ones of, illegal substances or substances that you need to be 21 to imbibe, but what other sort of, medications are you allowed to share with minors or not? These are things you want your adults to know, and you probably want to know that too. Oh boy. And what is considered sexting in I don't know if that's super different state to state, but it would be a good thing. Oh, it is. Evan's like, yeah, it's very different. Yeah, you could see I'm not the one that's researched that one yet.
Let me just give some examples to help people understand some of this. So in Ohio, in any violation within the sexual codes is child abuse, and yet if a minor is sending a nude picture of themselves to someone over 18, they have created child abuse, and the punishment could be worse for them. Having our youth understand and know that is important. Other states have they've reduced it to misdemeanors if it's between a certain age range, or they have you have to go to class if something happens. We do have there is a state where if the age difference is at all over 2 years, having sexual contact, it is a mandated report. And I say contact and conduct because those are two words to look for in the legal language. There are different ages of consent for touch, which is contact, and often another age of consent for contact, which is sex, intercourse, definitely, and different laws define oral and anal differently as well. And sharing substances with minors, the other piece there is if you have an 18-year-old who shares pot with an underage person, what kind of a law do you have around that, which can help, and especially education for the youth. A more than 4-year age gap on sharing pot in Ohio is a felony. And I echo everything Kim has said, and I think it's really critical for our youth to know this stuff, that our youth are often the ones talking to their peers and giving out sex ed information because we give them good sex ed information. And I'd love for our youth to be the ones saying to their peers, God, don't have sex with your girlfriend. Come on. It's over the age limit. Don't. And having our youth understand that when they're the older party involved, even if the consequence is a misdemeanor, as it can be, some states will have a felony over a large age gap and then a misdemeanor over a smaller age gap. It still means that your younger partner's parents are important, because they can be mad at you and they can get you in trouble. So that, look it up. I keep track of the laws in the states where we hold events, and it's very complicated. So we won't try to tell you about your state.
It's one of the things at Church Mutual, when I spent a few days with them last year. One of the things that they mentioned that often happens is that with two teens, even if the teens are reporting that it's consensual, once parents get involved, that story can often change. In that, I get it, and
it's that change is not. Sometimes we can see that as the teens are being pressured to change, but often when I've asked the consent question directly, I actually am not sure I'm getting accurate information. When we ask, how did you feel about that? We get a different answer sometimes. Oh, well, it was really uncomfortable. I also have my youth bringing me stories a year or so later. This is about things that happen outside my events that they're seeking assistance reconciling with their peers. And they're able to name that it takes them sometimes months to understand how they felt about something that happened. And so that might be that their parents getting involved helps them sort that out. Which is a nice transition here. Your youth need to have some kind of a structure and training that helps them come forward with things. Most issues don't look obvious when they need to be reported. So there needs to be a way of, this is the weird uncomfortable. It's also the investigate everything. So instead of hearing I think so-and-so kissed somebody in the dark and saying, oh, okay, it was just a kiss. You got to look into it. Have to look under all those rocks, because when we start asking questions about things that happen, often the story is very different than the one that initially comes to us. Because we as adults don't get the first-hand version. We get the third, fourth-hand version sometimes. We need to be clear about who's responsible for following up with issues, who does the interviews, who intervenes. Critical that responsibility is not given to someone who's overloaded. So if you have one paid youth staff person who's running the event and making sure the food happens and training the stay awake adults and whatnot, it's very hard for them to care about that peck on the cheek they just heard about, to say, okay, you're telling me because someone's uncomfortable. Let's follow up with that. They don't have the bandwidth or brain space, no matter how awesome of a person they are and how much they care about youth safety. The people need to have the space. And it needs to be more than one person, and I really recommend having some youth included. It's really, this is not a single point of failure thing. It's really easy for one person not to really get that something's a big deal or not hear the story well, but if there's more than one person and they need to talk to somebody else and say, yeah, let's have the check-in, well, this is what I heard, and that out loud processing allows people to say, oh, okay, this is something we need to look into. You need a clear process. So this is really stressful to deal with in the moment. This is probably the number one consultation I provide to congregations. They found out something happened. What do they do? So I would start with interviews. Those interviews need to include compassion. They need to be find out what happened, but also how someone was feeling, why they did what they did. I always ask, how did you feel about what was happening, as well as why was it you were doing this? And interviewing youth separately, and having some thought about how to help them be honest about what happened. The key pieces here for me we're making a shift in Central East from a punishment model, which I think is our default psychology, to a restorative justice model. And we're getting training in studying that, because we discovered that the punishment, okay, so you did X, this happened, Y happens to you, was creating a lot of shame. And so it was making it harder for youth to report things. And when the youth sort of participating in a more restorative process, they brought more things to us. They started naming more things. So when they know that the process is going to be compassionate, it's going to emphasize safety, not who's wrong, who's to blame, who did the wrong thing, but what do we need to do to keep everyone safe, which could include sending someone home, because right now we can't trust them to keep people safe. And thinking about what's a process that restores relationships, and not on a surface level, not a papering it over, but what's going to allow us to trust each other again, trust these people again, trust this person again. What's the process that will allow that to happen? When youth can trust that, they come forward more. And as I said, as we've done more of this in Central East, I'm getting a lot more stories. And these are actually, the ones I'm getting now are stories that happen between youth outside of our events. And yet they deeply impact their relationships inside the events and their trusted leaders. And I want those stories to come out, because if a youth is hurting people outside our events, they're not going to be a safe leader in our events. So I don't consider that, like a problem. I guess you could see it was a problem. I don't see it's a problem. So this is repeating some of this, but it's so important that we're clearly communicating that structure to the youth and parents, showing the youth how they're in covenant. And not just, the youth sometimes think they're just in covenant in the youth group. They're in covenant with the parents, the congregation, the insurance company, you, the staff, the board, and understanding that all those covenants are renegotiable, but they're not renegotiable in the moment, and they have to be negotiated out loud. When we made these sleeping changes in Central East, there are people who are not happy with them. And I said, I'm really happy to sit down with you to explain why, what the problems are, the problems the insurance company has, the problems I have now that I've done some digging. And if you can come up with a solution that meets all those problems, let's look at it. No one has, but helping the youth understand it's not just a hard, fast, forever necessarily. Things get improved. When we know better, we do better. And we want them to be part of the process. And they need to understand that we can only have youth events where we have trust, and that it's their responsibility to help maintain that trust. Have a congregation that had some substance issues at one of their overnights, and the process before they could have another overnight was long, and the youth are really tired of it, and yet they've learned some deep lessons about what it takes to rebuild trust, and sharing case studies and having conversations before that happens, so that they understand that it's not just to punish the two people who did something and then the trust is back, but it's going to be a larger process to restore trust, particularly when the other youth have not reported on their peers. Because when they come forward and say, we have a problem, we need your help to deal with this, then we can trust them to bring us other problems. And it's not that we think there's never going to be problems. We need to know that we're going to find out about the problems. And so the big problem is, and as I tell my youth, things happen. I want to know about them. I want to know when they're little and small and easy to deal with. And the problem we would really have is if I found out there was a pattern of not reporting things that are a problem, then that's what's going to be the big deal. I just said the first thing there. We know things happen. Again, weird and uncomfortable. We need them to come forward. And facilitating covenant is one of my new phrases in the last few years, that we are not enforcing rules, we're facilitating covenant, that we are helping the community come together to keep everybody safe. That we all have a responsibility to do that. And so the particular leaders who are receiving those reports are facilitators of covenant. And I would use a case study, and we will send you some. And I think that brings us to our Q&A.
Yeah,
anything to add, Kim?
Yeah, I do have something to add. I was just talking to Evan before we got on this webinar, and I thought if we had some more time today or yesterday to sort of redo this webinar, I would have, and I'll tell you why. We've seen so many reports over the past 48 hours and longer, really, about our youth really feeling unsafe in their context, in their communities, in our country right now, which I think just makes this work even more vital and more important. So some of the things that we talked about tonight are, that's our typical youth ministry stuff, but our people are dealing with some really hard things right now, and their feelings of safety are threatened. For some of our youth, that's just a daily occurrence. For some of our youth, this is going to be a little bit new. But we need to create our spaces to be as safe as possible so that they can start to deal with some of these issues that, we're all sort of, grappling with right now. Sex might not come up at your next youth event, but creating this structure and this container so that our youth can really survive. I mean, that's all I want for our youth, for them to be able to survive their adolescence and get through to adulthood. So it just feels more important now than ever to really pay attention to creating these safe environments for our youth. And on that note, we do have some time for questions. If there's anything that this has brought up for you, any specific questions, Evan and I might be able to give some feedback to now. Please feel free to post that in the chat. We are going to try to follow up with every resource that we mentioned. Good, we have a recording to remind ourselves. We'll also be able to save the chat, so anything that you put in there we'll also get to look back at and see. Evan, do you want to talk about, there's a few questions or comments about the role of chaplains in youth events. I'm thinking you might be better poised to speak to that.
I typically would see the chaplain as a support role and wouldn't put them in the facilitating covenant role. It makes it very difficult to really just support people. And yet a chaplain is really helpful in the larger processes. So in facilitating covenant, we're trying to make a shift from, say, around exclusive behavior. So two youth are like sitting in the corner being exclusive. Instead of having folks come up to them and say, you're being exclusive, have folks come up and say, I noticed, observe, that you two are hanging out by yourselves and I feel left out. Can we talk about that as a start to the process, which starts it on a nonviolent restorative justice front? And yet that conversation is one that if it needs to move to the next level of, okay, we've had a couple of these conversations with you, you're still just hanging out in the corner by yourselves and people are really feeling uncomfortable and upset about this. You don't want the chaplain leading that conversation. You want the chaplain actually supporting those people rather than even having the perception of authority over them.
And our chat is blowing up with questions about how to communicate restrictions around safety, especially since all people, not even youth, we all have different ways of communicating these days, including, from the sounds of it, carrier pigeon in at least one congregation here. And I think with the communication piece, it really comes down to creating a culture of safety, not just in your youth group, but in your entire congregation, where over time, it doesn't happen overnight, over time it becomes the expected norm. So in congregations where they are really publicly posting their safety policies, right on the front page of their website, where it's something that's preached about, from the pulpit, where it's really sort of infused in all aspects of congregational life to a point that it's not just the safety because the youth are around. And it needs to be bigger than that. I get that this is where we're starting from, but when the youth are there in the room together, that's an opportunity to be really talking about and working through some of the youth ministry safety issues. So like Evan said, taking a case study and working through that with your youth. Sitting there and giving them every case study in one day would probably be a little overwhelming. But if this is a regular practice and a regular part of your communication and discussions, I think it would be helpful to get it as more of the culture instead of that special conversation we have, every now and again.
So I want to add on to the communication here. We communicate in lots of different ways. So having a written covenant or expectations that everyone signs as they join the youth program, we could. Beginning of the year covenanting where within the program where things get talked about. Before overnights where there's greater risk, going back over some of this stuff is important. And it's not important that everybody's in the room every time. What is important is that we repeat. As the language gets into the youth heads and they claim it for themselves, they will reinforce it with each other. And I think that that's the most important thing. So it feels less important to me that every youth is at every conversation and listens to every word the adult says, and more important that we're creating youth who are able to notice what happens and speak up. And so the youth that are in the room are the right youth to have the conversation with.
Yeah, and it really becomes part of their lexicon and their DNA. So I have 2 high school youth in my home, and they hear me talking about this, like on webinars and on the phone and whatever, all the time. This is like they're the ones talking to their friends about safety, in other contexts, because it's just become like part of who they are. They've just heard it so much, it's in there. I got it in there. And so, the more that you talk about it, I think the more natural it will become for your youth to really to own that. So Megan has a question about chaplain training that would be focused on middle schoolers. I'm not aware of one of those, Evan. I don't know if you have a resource for that.
We don't do chaplain training for middle schoolers in Central East for a range of different reasons. The typical chaplain training prepares youth in a chaplain role to be able to handle crisis with peers, including cutting, suicide, drug abuse, etc. And the average 12 or 13-year-old is not ready to be in that position with a peer. I think that with middle schoolers, you could talk to your regional staff about getting portions of the chaplain training, the active listening, the paraphrasing, the questions would be just great to do with all of them. And so I would think that rather than trying to have a middle school age chaplain, being able to develop the capacity of all of them to listen to each other and support each other. And then have the conversation with all of them about what you do when something's too big and you can't keep someone safe. The way I talk about that with all my youth, not just the chaplains, is I talk about a spectrum. So between the youth who's shooting up heroin every night and the one who had a sip of alcohol when their parents are out of town and feels guilty, somewhere there's a line. And your gut says, I can't keep this person safe. And so training all the middle schoolers on when your gut says, whew, that's over the line, I'm going to find an adult. And listening would be how I would approach that. And that's just about development. It's just there might be occasionally a 13-year-old ready, but not very frequently.
All right, I think that's all we have right now for questions, Evan. What's next?
What's the next slide? I was making sure we finished the question. I was reading the chat carefully, trying to get all the details here about the chaplain question. Okay, looks like we're in good shape there. Yeah. So what's going to happen next? This was supposed to be done. It's not done, but other things have happened in the world this week. There will be a kind of a workshop-y thing for you to do locally with your people. There's a lot here that we just said, like, you got to solve this locally. So that's the work to be done locally. We'll send resources. Encourage you to talk about those case studies and talk about your particular context with the people in your congregation. You could do that as a cluster as well. And then we encourage you to think about what are the next steps for safety in your congregation, and then reach out to your congregational life staff. We have congregational life staff working in youth ministry and in safe congregations in all the regions. So reach out to your primary contact when you know what the next pieces you need to work on, and we collectively are available to consult.
Yes. Can I get the next slide? Oh, thanks. We want to leave you with some closing words tonight, and just remind you that you will get all of this either in your email or it'll be available online next week. But our closing words tonight are by Wayne Arneson. He says, "Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone." Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. I think we have, Evin and I are here tonight on behalf of the Youth Ministry Roundtable, a national group that we have been sitting on for a while now. But our colleagues here, if you haven't seen them on a webinar yet, you will see them coming up. They are from the Office of Congregational Life, the Youth and Young Adult Office. Next month's webinar series will be focused on pastoral care to and with youth. So you can put that down on your calendar. We'll have an evening session on December 8th, and then also one on December 13th, and we will fix the typos on that slide. You will see that on Facebook. It'll get emailed out as a reminder, and bring your friends, bring the people working with youth in your setting. Thank you all so much. It was great to be with you for this hour, and thanks for your attention to safety and youth ministry. We love it. Thanks all. Have a good night.